When James returned in the direction of the house, the now probably repaired tractor stood out front, although it still stretched its arm towards the heavens in an almost celebratory manner. But at least it had been cleared of all the snow in the meantime. Opening the door roughly, James basically shoved the kids inside and directed them in the direction of the living room. "Sit down, shut up, and so help me if I see you mess with anything," he warned them, with a threateningly raised finger. Obviously, Flynn had already alerted everyone to the current situation, and therefore concerned faces approached him as soon as he was done babysitting, although his uncle himself was still out of sight. "What exactly is going on?" Nia asked him, throwing only a brief concerned look at their more or less involuntary guests before focusing her dark eyes fully on him. Standing a step behind her, Tuya raised an eyebrow at him in a mixture of warning and concern. Although it was completely unnecessary. It wasn't like he was planning on running around and babbling in their current company. "Protesters or something," he explained, in as vague terms as he could while he shook his head. "Seemingly unhappy with what I do, accusing me of all kinds of things. Are the police on their way? I doubt that shit is registered." He briefly wiped some sweat from his forehead that was building up now that he had entered the much warmer inside. His nose was also once again assaulted by the strange and unfamiliar stench of what had to be litres worth of air freshener. Nia nodded, and nervously fiddled with one of her thick braids. "Flynn called them right away, I think," she confirmed. James briefly glanced around. "Where's he now?" he asked, in a mix of worry and nervous agitation. Nia could only look at him unknowingly, and slightly shook her head as well. "If he's not with you, then I don't know where he went." She excused herself, the same worry now seemingly taking hold of her as well. Slightly ticked off, James scoffed. "What? He ran off and just left those two behind?" he asked, in admittedly misplaced irritation, and gestured towards the two influencers, who had sunken down onto the couch they had been directed towards, and now seemed to try and take up as little space and attention as they possibly could. Pushing herself forth in his direction, Tuya came to Nia's defense. "She told you, we don't know," she bluffed at him, and although it was hard in the first moment, James knew that he was the ass here. So after a brief battle with himself, he backed off. Turning around with a swift swing of his arms, he brought his hands up to his face and slowly dragged them down while trying to think. "And Sheeta and Coco?" he asked, with a brief glance back, having regained a bit of a calmer tone now. Still, Tuya scowled at him slightly. However, Nia didn't hesitate in keeping the conversation going. "Getting dressed," she quickly notified him, and indicated towards the basement with a tilt of her head. James nodded appreciatively, and took a deep breath, focusing even further. "All right," he said, and rubbed a bit more sweat away with his sleeve. "Tell them to meet me upstairs. I gotta make a few calls. Nobody else come after me. Got it?" He looked at everyone to make sure that the message sunk in that he was being serious. He looked especially long at Tuya, not because he felt like she needed to understand it the most, but because she was the one who was most qualified to make it a reality, even if someone else didn't want to comply. Seemingly realizing from his gaze alone that something more was up here, she quickly turned in a way that would have her back facing towards the kids, and Nia's back facing towards her. Then, once she was out of sight for everyone but him, she quietly mouthed, "Is it bad?" James replied by almost unnoticeably nodding, which caused his colleague to immediately straighten up slightly. Technically she was on vacation, of course, but they both knew all too well that what they had been pulled into was so much bigger than them. "Got it," she said, loudly this time. "I'll watch your 6. Then she glared over to their guests in a, "If you want to make trouble, you'll have to deal with me" kind of way. Her glare was quite effective in making the poor kids, who were completely out of their depth here, sink into themselves even more. I love your hair," the green-haired one mumbled towards her fellow greenhead, in a vain attempt at diffusing the tension. "Do you dye or engineer?" A rather dumb question, given that you could literally see Tuya's roots growing out at the moment, but that was so far down James's priorities that he basically didn't notice it at all. He just stomped up the stairs while pulling out his phone as he went. Once he had reached the attic, he basically tossed a coin as to who he should contact first, and it landed on his direct superiors. Surprisingly, he was almost immediately put through all the way up the ladder of importance, right towards Representative Kumar, who was a person that you usually really weren't supposed to get in contact with without making a scheduled appointment way in advance. But, perhaps unsurprisingly, the body representative of the Triad Kakumina also didn't sound all too surprised about so suddenly being called by him, or about what James had to tell him exactly. In his agitated state, it maybe took James a bit longer to figure it out than it should have, but it soon clicked for him that this entire thing was apparently all but unexpected. They knew something, at the very least. And he hadn't been warned? Representative, I'm going to be unbelievably charitable here, and assume that there is a very good reason that your demeanor tells me that you expected something like this, that I have, however, not been informed of. I would, however, urgently request that you share that reason with me, before I assume that you simply decided my and my family's safety were none of your concern, James finally said into his phone, forcing his voice to be near robotically cold and unwavering as he spoke, out of fear that he might snap and yell at one of the most important people on Earth, which would not only be bad for obvious reasons, but might also be heard downstairs if he just got loud enough. I understand your concern, Mr. Aldwin, but please be reasonable. Of course I didn't know that people would show up at your doorstep, Kumar replied in his professional voice, and James was sure that he could hear him readjust his tie on the other end of the line for a moment. An unconfirmed leak has shown up on the net a while ago, while you were still in hyperspace. Speaking of the things that happened on Dunima in too much detail to be a coincidence or lucky guess. It spread through the net over some time, but never gained enough traction to be of major concern. We investigated it, but made no efforts to deny it or shut it down, in order to not give it any legitimacy. Without our intervening or convincing evidence, with whatever whistleblower is involved apparently either doesn't possess or is unwilling to share with the people, it just became another crackbox ramblings on the net. There are thousands of those. I expected people to show up at your home just as little as I expect people to drive to the Regent's Remembrance Monument and dig for the royal corpses underneath. Admittedly, James had to remove his phone from his face for a moment in order to keep his cool. Closing his eyes, he breathed in, held, and out. He was in control. He could get through this without flipping out. Slowly, he lifted his phone back up. There is a confirmed information leak happening, and I was not informed of it? He asked, supporting himself against the nearest wall to deliberately take tension out of his body. The list of things he didn't know just kept getting longer. Even if you didn't think something would happen, a notice or briefing would have been prudent and necessary at the very least. Kumar exhaled slowly. Any legitimacy we would have given to these claims could have been, he began. However, James wasn't even going to humour that excuse. Sir, that is weak, and you know it. He cut the representative off. Informing me of harmful rumours floating around the net about me would in no way have legitimised the claims, even if someone had somehow leaked that conversation as well. Nobody in the entire world could fault us for taking the simple precaution of being aware what is said about us. He almost immediately had to focus himself again. Even if he was agitated, cutting Kumar off wasn't exactly the best move in his position. Sticking to etiquette would get him much further than acting angry and petulant. He would have to go with a reasonable angle. Representative, I am the son of an admiral. He changed his course, figuring he would go the diplomatic route, even if it annoyed him that he had to bring his mother into this. Even when she wasn't as high of a rank yet, I was taught behaviours, code phrases, contacts, and the location of safe houses for my entire life, just to give me a better chance of survival and rescue, in case enemies of my family would someday come for me or my home. I am conditioned to look for risks in situations, and seek to control them to an unhealthy degree, I know that. But these people that are at my home right now, They could just as well have been much more aggressive. They could have been armed. I could have been armed. This entire situation could have easily escalated on both sides if either side had just acted even slightly more recklessly or aggressively than they did. I understand that what's done is done now, but something like this absolutely, positively, it cannot happen again. Please at least tell me that you understand that. Kumar was quiet for a moment, while James leaned against the wall even more. The possibilities of what would have happened if those protesters had been attackers, or if they had actually tried to make their way into the compound, or 1,000 other scenarios that were worse than what did actually happen. He didn't even want to imagine them. It was annoying how powerless he felt, being able to do little more than plead that this may not happen again. Because, honestly, what else was he going to do? Threaten the representative with leverage that he didn't have? He was speaking to one of the leaders of an entire nation here. Finally, the representative spoke up again. So far, the information leak could not be tracked to any single source, but given the timeline of events, our experts are certain that, whoever it came from, they knew about it right from the start. He explained slowly, and in no uncertain terms, although a hint of understanding was noticeable in his voice. While it is highly unlikely, but in no terms impossible, that someone from the outside somehow gained and leaked the information, the suspicion that it came from one of the first few people to know is the much more likely one. We are leaving no avenues in this matter unexplored. James deflated slightly as he exhaled. You didn't tell me because I was a suspect? He asked in slight disbelief. Why in the world would he be considered a suspect? At face value, he knew, of course. He was one of the most likely people, given the time frame. But he was also the damaged party here. Why would he make himself out to be a traitor or bringer of destruction? Kumar cleared his throat audibly. Not you specifically, of course, but you were in close contact with multiple suspects at all times, he explained further. James wasn't even close to getting angry anymore. At this point, he just felt empty. Not out of any suspicion or sense of betrayal. It was just the sheer realization of how much any decision could be rationalized away, if only there was the right motivation for it. You said yourself that we were in hyperspace while the rumors started, he gave back, vainly trying to show the obvious problems with the story. But even if he could entirely debunk it, it would mean nothing. The decision had been made, and he would have to deal with that. You know as well as I do that something like that can be arranged way in advance. Kumar dismissed his weak non-defense. James nodded, obviously just to himself. And what now? He asked glumly. Kumar clicked his tongue in contemplation and sighed. You are still under investigation, but personally, I highly doubt you will have to worry about that. He at first confirmed for James, before his tone turned a bit firmer as he added, and if the threats to your safety should persist, we will obviously do what we can to mitigate them. As an acting ambassador and political candidate, you are certainly entitled to protective services. It also helps that you are part of the UHSDF and can therefore use their facilities. I'm afraid your vacation will be tragically cut short, though. James sighed. It wasn't like he had expected much else here, even if he had previously managed to delude himself into believing that he could just take a while off to get his mind off things. Living a simple life, or dealing with simple problems for a bit. But that was just not in the cards anymore. Not until this was over. What about the leak? He asked further, not wanting his thoughts to linger on the image of finding no peace for a long, long time ahead of him. We'll deal with it, Kumar replied, his voice now shifting into a bit of unexpected hardness. I've told you, you are still a suspect. I have to ask for your forgiveness for how it was handled so far. From now on, you will get every bit of information that is necessary for your safety, I guarantee it. However, unless you are cleared of suspicion, that is all the information you will get on the topic. And your actions from now on will be monitored, until we can be sure that your intentions are pure. James sighed. Well, there wasn't much room to argue there. Well, there was, but he doubted that it would do him any good. I understand, he half lied. Well, he did understand. He just didn't entirely agree. We will have everything arranged to have you and, if necessary, your family moved to a secure location until your next mission or foreign visit, the representative declared. I wish you the best of luck that Sky doesn't come down on you in the meantime. Clearing his throat, James closed the conversation with a, "Thank you, Representative. Goodbye." He closed his eyes for a few seconds after hanging up. Then, when he opened them again, he looked over to the side of the room, where Coco and Sheeda had quietly listened in on everything, after following up to the attic. "Holy," Coco mumbled, and wiped a bit of hair out of her face for the nth time, clearly not used to wearing it open like she was now. "We have to warn Avezalon," Sheeda emphatically pressed, her eyes drilling into James's as she nervously fiddled with her hands. "If this information leaves Earth..." She broke off there, but James nodded. That would spell catastrophe. He would also have to talk to the Admiral about this. Whether he liked it or not, everyone here was, in a way, her family as well. Therefore, he prepared for a number of more long calls. During his conversations, Sheeda, Coco and Tuya were periodically changing up who was upstairs with him and who was standing guard in the living room. They of course still had to be careful that nobody who didn't already know would be unwittingly informed of what was going on, even if the information leak was already long established. They couldn't accidentally confirm anything. Therefore, as James was unsure of how secure his connection to Avezalon was, he simply left her as Sheeda quickly put together an encoded message, of which he was sure that the artificial sapient would have no problem in deciphering it in no time. He warned them of the situation, to be extra careful, to keep their head down, and to have a close eye on the net for any emerging rumours outside of Earth. Then, after that, he called the Admiral. She wasn't exactly happy about him trying to contact her during an important conference. However, when he explained himself, she soon calmed down. Surprisingly to probably everyone involved, their conversation got heated and serious in places, but overall stayed rather civil. Neither of them yelled. They didn't accuse each other of anything, or try to shift any blame around. They simply discussed what would be the plan for them and their relatives going forwards, even if their tone and choice of words turned a bit rough around the edges a few times as they did so. For them, there was basically a record of restraint and civility. However, this involved people they both cared about. Still, as someone who wasn't quite so familiar with their interactions yet, Tuya sucked in a very sharp breath when James finally hung up after a good hour of talking and planning. "Wow, James," she commented, as he put his phone away and looked up to her, pushing himself away from the wall, ready to go about the next steps. "I don't know what to think here, but you're a braver man than me. I mean, my age isn't even an Admiral, but if I talk to her like that..." James interrupted her with little more than a sharp exhale. "What's she supposed to do? Demote me? I'm voluntoid, so that's not scary. Punish me? Whatever she tries for that, I won't do it. Worst she can do for insubordination is demote or fire me, so that's not scary. Yell at me? That's not scary. And I'm more than a head taller than her and weigh over 25 kilogram more. So if she tries to hit me, I'm going to win," he explained, in no uncertain terms with an empty voice, as he moved towards the door. Tuya looked at him in slight disbelief. "Jeez," she mumbled, and began to follow after him. James rolled his eyes. "What? It's the truth," he gave back, pretty uncaringly. Tuya inhaled, briefly. "Yeah, technically," she replied with slight hesitation, "but still, geez." She left it at that as they descended the stairs together. At the bottom, Sheeda leaned against the wall across the last step, forming a sort of barrier with her body. As the two approached her, she briefly looked up at them and lifted a finger to her lips, indicating to be quiet. Turning their gazes slightly, they could see why. Standing in the middle of the living room, Simon had lifted his camera once again and was pointing it towards his green-haired friend, who stood in front of it with far less enthusiasm than she had previously done. We only caught the tail end of whatever she was saying, but it seemed that she was giving a sort of status report. Okay, I think the police is here by now, so they probably have the situation under control. I know it looked a bit scary there for a moment, but I also get Mr. Olwen's reaction to it all. I mean, this is his home, and having a bunch of people show up and yell and throw things at you must be even scarier for him. So yeah, I just wanted to let you all know that. Already posted a status, but I think it got buried a bit in the sea of replies. So I figured just quickly popping in and directly saying it might be better. We're still in the private house here, so we're going to end the stream again now. We just wanted to make sure nobody panics. We're fine, and everyone's being very nice to us, now that the first scare is over. Once everything's clear outside, the police will give us an escort home as well. We love you all, and thank you so much for your concern about us. Bye, Ziz. While he listened to the explanation, James briefly signed towards Sheeda, asking what's going on. Apparently their fans were freaking out, Sheeda replied silently, with a few movements of her hands. We figured a quick "we're okay" probably wouldn't hurt. Glancing over again, James noticed that Coco had been standing right next to Simon the entire time. Now that the camera was being turned off again, she noticeably relaxed, so James figured that she had likely been ready to intervene and shut off the feed at any moment, if something unwelcome had been said during the broadcast. Looking around a bit more, he also noticed that he didn't spot Nia anywhere. Seeing that the camera was off now, James felt emboldened to speak aloud again. What a mess, he sighed, and briefly cracked his neck to both sides before Sheeda got out of his way so he could go all the way down into the living room. Simon chuckled as he started to store his camera away into a secure bag. You can say that again, he mumbled more to himself, while his partner approached James. I am so sorry about all this, the lime green-haired influencer exclaimed, and put on a sorry and or slightly pouting facade as they spoke to him, pushing their arms down and their bottom lip out to present themselves as more vulnerable, while also obviously intentionally underlining their feminine features. Everything was happening so fast, and we're so used to filming everything that's going on, and we didn't know who you were. Speaking of which, I'm Nicola, by the way, although I'm better known as Cessatrix these days. It's an honour to meet you. I'm a big fan, by the way. Seeing how utterly unimpressed James looked back at her, Nicola quickly changed her behaviour back to a more normal one, likely in an attempt to not seem desperate, and she politely offered him her hand in greeting. James accepted it and shook it for a moment. Her hand laid in his like a dead fish, offering no pressure to speak of as they shook hands. I'm sorry too, he lied. Feeling like being polite was the best way to save some public face here. In reality, he would have done the exact same thing again if given the chance. It was the heat of the moment. Also, I don't think ambassadors are supposed to have fans. Pulling her hand back, she chuckled at his statement. Well, you're more than an ambassador at this point. I guess you usually call them, what, followers? Supporters? Something in that direction when talking about politicians. But it's not that far off from a fan ultimately, is it? She proclaimed, and took a step back away from him, while bringing her hands behind her back and gently swaying her body from side to side. Whatever you want to call it. I think it's great what you're doing, the whole leave people alone, they're not hurting anybody thing. That was a pretty gross simplification of what James was actually saying, but at least her heart was in the right spot. Or at least she claimed it was. On his list of priorities, pushing his exact political stance right now was extremely far down at the bottom, and so James just smiled it off. Especially since he was getting the odd feeling that this girl was simply trying to get him to talk a little too much. It was just a hunch, though. Well, I'm sorry about your tour being ruined. He simply dismissed the conversation. Meanwhile, given that there was no broadcast going on anymore, Sheeda had decided to switch on the TV, and was now seemingly browsing the channels for any news stations whose language she would be able to understand. James remembered that habit of hers from their time on Dunima, and even though he doubted that anything about it would be on the news already, he left her to it. For a moment, he was about to tell her to pack up, just in case. However, he then recalled that they basically hadn't even unpacked yet. However, The same wasn't true for Nia and Flynn. He excused himself from everyone briefly, and then stepped out of the room, determined to find out wherever his direct family had suddenly run off to. They hadn't been anywhere upstairs, so much was clear. Flynn's room was also empty, and a quick peek into the basement showed little more than empty rooms, and the hastily left open sauna that likely had been left like that when Sheeta and Coco had been alerted to the situation. But there was still no sign of his sister or uncle. Given that the house appeared to have been left behind, James decided to briefly check outside. As long as he stayed inside of the compound, he should be safe enough. It would also give him an opportunity to check on the dogs, as he was afraid that one of the stone-throwing wannabe protesters may have injured one of the animals at some point after he left. The dogs were hardy, but thrown rocks were thrown rocks. Figuring that the information of the police getting things under control was probably reliable, he therefore whistled loudly for the animals, calling them towards him, while he searched around the house to see if he couldn't find Flynn or Nia anywhere out here. And now that he was listening for it, he felt like he may have heard their voices coming from somewhere in the back. He couldn't understand what was being said, however, he felt like they were sounding slightly agitated. Given the situation, that wasn't especially surprising. However, somehow, it sounded more like they were agitated with each other than with the situation. He followed the hushed voices that the cold air carried to his ears all the way to the shed behind the back of the house, where the pile of hastily discarded decorations was still prettying up the usual pile of garbage. Nia stood, slightly leaned forward, her arms tightly slung around her body, as she was seemingly fighting against the cold, since she had left the house wearing little more than a knitted sweater and jeans, instead of her usual winter get-up. Her voice filled the air with tiny wafts of steam, as she seemed to incessantly try to appeal to Flynn somehow. Flynn, meanwhile, stood leaned against one of the shed's support beams with his eyes closed, and a hesitant yet hardened expression, and he only replied to Nia in short, brief answers that almost seemed to be intended to shut the conversation down. Although he wanted to know what was going on, James decided that he had to get to the serious business first, before he could find out what their squabble was about. "You two need to pack," he announced as he came closer, and both of them seemed to get a bit startled, as they had apparently not noticed him coming. "Only a few bags, just in case things get worse." He didn't elaborate much more than that, admittedly. Just like him, the both of them had lived a long time with the conditioning of the Admiral, meaning they too were used to cautious measures being taken at any hint of a threat. Nia looked back at him worriedly. She didn't resist or ask what any of this was about, likely aware that if any of them could talk about it, they would likely do so of their own accord. However, right now, she seemed a lot more worried about something else, but her eyes told James that she wasn't just going to come out with it. Meanwhile, Flynn just shook his head. "I'm going nowhere, kid," he declared, almost aloofly, as he leaned against the beam. "Animals ain't taking care of themselves." James sighed slightly, really hoping that they wouldn't have to go through all this. "Flynn, you know that's not the problem," he said, trying his best to appeal to his uncle's sense of reason. "We can hire caretakers, send someone to handle the compound. Our own safety comes first." Flynn shook his head again and let out a hoarse groan. "Your safety comes first," he corrected James, and looked at his nephew with slightly sunken eyes while crossing his arms. "I'm just some old guy with an animal rescue. Ain't got nothing to do with your big business." "I don't think they care," James replied urgently. However, Flynn held tight to his position, it seemed. "Kid, I've taken care of you and your mum for 45 years. Can't you have a little trust that I know what I'm doing?" he asked, and sounded the slightest bit annoyed. However, it sounded more like he was trying to sound annoyed, because most of his voice actually just seemed tired. "I may be an old coot, but I'm not yet ready for an elderly home, so you can let me make my own decisions." James recoiled slightly, honestly taken aback. "I never said anything of the like," he defended himself, honest hurt seeping into his voice. The thought would never even have occurred to him, not even to go so far as to imply it. Flynn's hard eyes stared at him for a moment, and he could basically see his uncle trying to keep his resolve steady. However, he couldn't keep it up, and soon they softened. "I know, kid," the old man mumbled, and averted his gaze. James looked at him in disbelief. "What is going on with you?" he asked tenderly, his voice giving away that the question was anything but an accusation, even if it was certainly phrased like one. "You've never been like this. Your work was never more important than your safety. Hell, I mean, the work isn't even getting done. Donations are piling up, decorations get left around, the tractor is just broken. What's going on?" Flynn averted his gaze a bit further, but his eyes furrowed in obvious sadness. "Nothing's going on, kid. Just been a bit lazy recently," he mumbled. Next to James, Nia sighed. For a moment, she looked back and forth between the two men, and it seemed like she was clearly torn on some decision she was making at that moment. She shifted her weight around as if physically fighting with herself as she weighed the options, but finally she exhaled slowly. Turning to her brother, she said, "I'm going to start packing. You try to talk some sense into him." Then, still slightly hesitating, she unfurled her arms and held something out in James's direction that had so far been hidden inside of her protectively held hand. "You should know this," she mumbled, although she didn't really elaborate on the item as James took it out of her hand. But she also didn't need to. He recognized it immediately, and he stared at it in shock as Nia turned to return to the house, shielding herself against the cold all the way. It was small, wrapped in white paper, and burned to ash at one end. The smell was also instantly recognizable, thick and musty, and did explain the amounts of air freshener. With big eyes, and holding the burnt thing in his open palm, James turned back towards his uncle. His voice quivered slightly as he asked, "You're relapsing?" Flynn released a breath through his teeth, steam shooting out like from an engine as he scrunched his face up. "I'm not relapsing. I'm relaxing," he gave back defensively. James closed his fist around the half-smoked joint of who knows what origin. "You're a recovered addict," he replied, his voice turning a bit firmer as he began to realize what has been happening. Flynn huffed, and he made eye contact again as he began to challenge his nephew. "Yeah, recovered. It's in the name," he gave back, and started to push himself to stand straight. "Doctors cleared me of everything, remember?" James shook his head, now basically swimming in worry. "That's just for the physical dependency," he replied, once again doing his best to stay calm and not freak out, so he wouldn't push his uncle away by antagonizing him. "This stuff still messes with your head." He lifted the joint with 2 fingers, presenting it to his uncle. "This is nothing you can just come back to relax." He reaffirmed his statement, while waving the tiny thing around. "You know that as well as me." "Why not?" Flynn asked with a dismissive scoff. "It's not like it is dangerous. Even coffee's worse for you in the end." James's face hardened. That horseshit wasn't even true ages ago, when these things weren't loaded with enough THC to euthanize a tiger, he shot back. The thought of his own uncle trying to make himself believe such obvious lies again, riling him up. It's a drug. All drugs are dangerous and have to be used with awareness and care, no matter the situation. And I don't care if it's coffee or heroin. Using it as a recovered addict is not using it with awareness and care. He threw the half-burnt butt into the snow. And I shouldn't have to tell you this. You know this. You've been through this. What in the world could possibly have made you go back to it? Do you seriously not remember the trouble you went through to get away from it? He dug further into his uncle, his emotions involuntarily overwhelming him, as his worry and sorrow broke out of him, even as he tried so hard to remain calm. Yelling and accusing didn't help, and he knew that, but he was just so disappointed. For a moment, Flynn kept up his hard, almost spiteful gaze. But soon, his lips and eyes began to slightly tremble, and James could see a single wet streak slowly run down his cheek. "Of course, I hadn't forgotten," he mumbled quietly, clearly afraid that his voice wouldn't obey him in producing his firm tone if he spoke any louder. "But I just don't know anymore, kid." He looked up, and their dark eyes met with each other. More tears started to slowly roll down his uncle's face, although his expression didn't really match the crying. "I was 30 when we made first contact, kid. 30. Hell, you aren't even that old yet. I'd already taken care of your mum for 15 years by then. And suddenly, aliens are a thing. Giant fucking lizards tall as a house. It was unreal at the time. We were all scared shitless. Nobody knew what to do around then. And what did your mother do? She decides she wants to get out there, see it for herself, and protect us if necessary. And for that she wanted to join the military. A year later, she suddenly starts with the UHSTF. 16 fucking years old," he began to explain, clearly keeping himself under control so he wouldn't burst out in any emotion, even though it was obvious that he had kept all this in for a long time, just by how effortlessly it bubbled out of him now. "She came back a bit late with a child. 3 years later, to be precise, around the time you were born. We were first starting to really get warm with the community, and she had a hell of a lot to do during that. Well, you know what happened. I took care of you while she did her thing. About a decade later, you brought Nia home, and that whole mess happened. Nothing but bundles of trouble you two were. But I still took care of you. Took care of you for the next 8 years. 8 years of you also wanting to get out there, but by yourself, not as a soldier, wanting to see the galaxy. Then, suddenly, Sophie wants you back. You fought, you yelled, you complained, but you still went. Left me alone with Nia. 3 years of service. Then you came back. You were battered, bruised. Had more scars than I could count, and you basically didn't talk about anything that happened. Hell, to this day I don't know what happened. I can only imagine death. But you came back. You had changed a bit, but you came back. Then you two went to study, but you were around again. Came by. Lived here over breaks. And before I knew it, 5 years were over. You passed your tests, you made your deals. And suddenly I stood on a space station, waving goodbye as you flew off to space. I never imagined it would actually happen. I mean, I was happy for you. But hell, who'd imagine that? Didn't take long before Nia followed you, even if she flunked her first tests. This time you were all gone, all free. And you wouldn't be back for a long time, and even then only for visits. I tried my best to make peace with that. And I could have. Sure, the nest was empty for the first time in a long, long while. But I think I could have dealt with that, had you just moved out. But you were out there. Out there in the dark, strange cosmos. Thousands of years. We didn't know if we were alone in the cosmos, and in the span of not even 30 years, you were out there. It was scary. Scary as hell, but I was trying to deal with it. Doing my best to just be happy for you. You made it. You achieved your dream. Fuck yeah, kid. But then... He cut off there, the tears now running down his face in a constant flow as he tore his eyes away again. Then you saw me on the news. James finished his sentence. Flynn shook his head, although it didn't seem like he was denying what James said. I don't know if I can do this, James, he said, his voice still holding strong despite the tears and his reddening face. You and your mum, you risk your life a lot, I know that. I've always lived with that, but that was always around in some way. But this time, seeing you on another planet without that arm, knowing just how far out of my reach you were, I just didn't know how to handle it anymore. And I still don't. James stared, hesitantly, confronted with the unshakable truth that he and his uncle, in a way, were living in different worlds. Flynn in the one that had once known loneliness, where the only thing that was Earth and its surroundings. And James in the one that knew better, that had always lived with the vastness of the universe around it. To James, another planet was just a place on a map. To Flynn, it was an unreachable infinity away. As much as he wanted to understand his uncle, he couldn't. He could only understand that he was afraid. A lot of things remained unsaid. A lot of things would have to be said. And a lot of work would have to be done. But for now, James simply embraced him. The man that had always been there for him. The man that had raised him. And the man that could fear for him so much more than anyone else in the world could. "Please, let's back up," he said, while holding his old man close. "Just in case, okay?"